Hi everyone, welcome to Azad Revenge Stories channel. They did not just push my husband out of a photograph. They made him hold the camera to capture the moment he was replaced. Under the warm lights of that family dinner, a chilling realization hit me. This was no accident. They had been preparing to cut us out of their future for a long time. Their biggest mistake was thinking I would just smile, stay silent, and sign whatever they put in front of me. My name is Ree Patterson. I am 38 years old, and I am the eldest daughter of the Patterson family. If you drive through the affluent, heavily manicured limits of Briar Glen, Tennessee, you will see our names stamped on bronze plaques at the gates of exclusive gated communities, etched into the cornerstones of high-end retail developments, and elegantly printed on the invitations to the most coveted charity galas of the season. We are the architects of the town's luxury ecosystem. Patterson Estate Group is not just a real estate and event management conglomerate. In Briar Glen, it is the closest thing to local royalty. We sell an image of flawless generational wealth, and my family spends every waking hour ensuring the veneer never cracks. I have always been the anomaly in that pristine picture. I do not work for the family business full-time. While my parents and sisters spend their days curating aesthetics and hosting investors, I sit in a high-rise office downtown as the senior contracts director for Blackidge Civic Partners, a massive infrastructure firm. My daily life does not revolve around picking the right linen napkins for a botanical garden fundraiser. Instead, I spend my time hunting for trapdoors in 100-page municipal agreements. I am paid a very high salary to read the fine print, to calculate liability, to anticipate disaster, and to smell a lie disguised as a promising clause from 50 m away. I live in a world of concrete risks and binding consequences. This background has made me fiercely analytical, perhaps a little cynical, but above all, deeply observant. I read people the exact same way I read a subcontractor's indemnity agreement. I look for what is deliberately left out. My husband, Owen Mercer, is 39 years old. When I met him in our late 20s, he was a sports photojournalist, a man who spent his life running up and down the sidelines of college football stadiums, capturing the exact fraction of a second when a game was won or lost. He thrived in chaos, but carried an immense grounding quietness inside him. Eventually, the travel wore him down, and he transitioned to running a highly successful boutique photography studio. Owen is not a loud man. He does not wear watches that cost more than a car, and he does not drop names at cocktail parties to establish his territory. He is fundamentally kind, remarkably patient, and possesses a core of self-respect that is entirely unshakable. He does not need the room to look at him to know he has a right to stand in it. We have been married for 11 years. Our life together is the sanctuary I built away from the exhausting theatricality of the Patterson name. We do not live in a sprawling multi-acre estate funded by my family's trust. We bought a beautiful historic 4-bedroom house on a quiet tree-lined street using our own money. We do not host lavish catered mixers for local politicians. We host small dinners in our backyard with real friends who laugh loudly and drink moderately priced wine. Our marriage is not a showpiece. It is a solid, enduring structure. Owen and I are the kind of couple who can communicate entire paragraphs of thought across a crowded room with a single shift of our eyes. I love him fiercely because he is the only truly real thing in my life. My mother, Lillian Patterson, views Owen through a lens of aristocratic pragmatism. To her, he is not a son-in-law to be cherished. He is an accessory that unfortunately does not match her carefully curated ensemble. Lillian has never been overtly cruel to Owen. She has never raised her voice at him, nor has she ever insulted his profession or his background to his face. She is far too refined for vulgarity. Instead, she employs a weaponized, insufficient politeness. When we attend family dinners, Lillian always ensures Owen is seated at the far end of the table, usually next to a distant elderly relative who cannot hear well, effectively isolating him from the central conversation. When introducing him to her socialite friends, she refers to him simply as Reese's husband, rushing past his name to talk about my corporate achievements. She treats him like a well-behaved dog that someone unfortunately brought to a formal dinner. You do not kick the dog, but you certainly do not set a plate for it. She keeps him permanently stationed on the outermost fringes of the family perimeter. Then there is my sister, Sloane. Sloane Patterson is 33 years old, strikingly beautiful, effortlessly sharp, and addicted to the spotlight. We grew up under an unspoken but heavily enforced family doctrine. I was designated as the capable one, the pragmatic workhorse who could fix a broken spreadsheet or negotiate a vendor dispute. Sloane was designated as the charismatic one, the glittering jewel meant to charm investors and look breathtaking in the annual holiday portrait. Sloane wears this label proudly, yet it masks a deep, corrosive insecurity. She demands attention because she secretly suspects she has nothing else of substance to offer. Furthermore, she harbors a dark, unspoken jealousy toward my marriage. Sloane has spent her 20s and early 30s bouncing between wealthy, charismatic men who eventually leave her feeling empty and paranoid. She looks at the quiet, unshakable devotion Owen has for me, and it offends her. In her mind, she is the prize, so she cannot reconcile why the plain, serious older sister gets the kind of love that does not require a filter or a performance. Presiding over all of this passive aggression is my father, Conrad Patterson. My father is a man who loves the illusion of peace far more than he cares about the uncomfortable truth. He built a real estate empire by being a phenomenal salesman, a man who can smooth over any disagreement with a firm handshake and a stiff drink. But at home, he is a coward. He allows Lillian to orchestrate the emotional climate of the household completely. If Lillian decides someone is to be frozen out, Comrade simply looks the other way, usually retreating to his mahogany-paneled study to watch golf on mute. He has spent decades stepping over the landmines his wife and youngest daughter laid down, actively avoiding any friction. He calls it keeping the family united, but I know it is just a refusal to protect anyone but himself. For over a decade, I accepted this dynamic. I rationalized it. I told myself that every wealthy family has its eccentricities and its unspoken hierarchies. I accepted my role as the family's crisis manager. When a contractor threatened to sue Patterson Estate Group, I was the one who quietly reviewed the documents on a Sunday afternoon and found the loophole to save them. When Sloane got a DUI at age 25, I was the one who managed the lawyers and kept it out of the local papers. I was the person they called when the house was on fire, not the person they called to sit by the hearth. I thought I understood the boundaries of their disregard. I believed that as long as I kept solving their problems, they would tolerate my quiet, unpretentious husband. I believed their treatment of Owen was just standard snobbery, a permanent but manageable flaw in the family fabric. I was blind to the deeper reality because I was too busy managing the surface. I never truly confronted the terrifying truth that was slowly taking shape in the shadows of their polite smiles. My family was not merely looking down on Owen. They were not just keeping him at arm's length because he lacked a trust fund or a prestigious pedigree. The casual dismissals, the forgotten invitations, the deliberate physical distancing at family events were not isolated incidents of bad manners. They were the preliminary steps of an active phase out. I thought I was so brilliant at reading the terms of an agreement. Yet, I completely missed the addendum my own family was drafting behind my back. They were methodically preparing the ground, waiting for the perfect moment and the perfect candidate to arrive. They were getting ready to replace my husband with a face that fit their brand, and they fully expected me to simply step aside and facilitate the transaction. It started in early autumn when the leaves in Briar Glen turned the color of rusted iron and the evening air grew sharp enough to bite. Sloane brought him to a Sunday dinner. His name was Roman Hale. He was 35 years old and introduced himself as a strategic capital advisor. From the exact moment he stepped through the heavy oak doors of my parents' home, I felt a cold warning prickle at the base of my neck. Roman did not simply speak. He delivered lines. Every single sentence that left his mouth felt meticulously rehearsed, likely practiced over and over in front of a bathroom mirror until all the natural hue and hesitation was rubbed completely smooth. He was incredibly tall, built like a man who spent exactly 2 hours every single day with an expensive personal trainer, and he wore custom-tailored suits that draped flawlessly over his shoulders without a single wrinkle. His physical presence was designed to command space. His handshake was a calculated, firm grip, holding on for exactly 1 second longer than necessary to establish dominance. His smile was a weapon. He deployed it at the precise millisecond it was required to disarm the room, flashing perfect white teeth that looked more like expensive architectural features than bone. His eyes, however, never quite joined the warmth of his mouth. They were always scanning, calculating, assessing the value of everyone in the room within a mere 3 weeks. Roman became an immovable fixture at our dining table. My mother fell under his spell almost instantaneously, which was rare. Lillian usually treated Sloane's previous boyfriends with a polite, freezing indifference, viewing them as temporary distractions. But Lillian did not love Roman because she took the time to understand his true character or his moral compass. She loved him because he was the exact physical manifestation of the man she had always visualized standing next to the Patterson logo on a glossy business magazine spread. He was slick. He was undeniably expensive to look at. He radiated the distinct manufactured scent of new money, aggressive ambition, and corporate power. When Lillian offered him a glass of our best vintage wine, he took it with a slight theatrical bow of his head and called her ma'am in a low, respectful drawl that absolutely melted her aristocratic defenses. My mother looked at Roman and saw the ultimate promotional accessory. She saw a man who could finally elevate our family photographs to the level of high society perfection she had chased her entire life. She started planning menus around his supposed dietary preferences and ensuring his favorite scotch was always stocked in my father's study. However, it was the dinner table conversations that caused my professional instincts to flare into high alert. Roman was absolutely not interested in asking the normal polite questions a new boyfriend asks to get to know a family. He did not care about our childhood memories, our favorite vacation spots, or our hobbies. Instead, he treated our Sunday roast like a corporate due diligence interrogation disguised as friendly banter. During a dinner in late October, the dining room was warm, filled with the scent of roasted lamb and the clinking of heavy silver. Roman casually steered the conversation away from the upcoming Cherokee season and directly into the architecture of my father's commercial land banks. He leaned forward, swirling his red wine, and asked highly specific, probing questions about the redevelopment zoning permits for the Hollow Creek House project. He did not stop there. He wanted to know about our bridge loan structures, our liquidity ratios, and our mezzanine financing options. He even casually floated a deeply invasive question regarding the generational transfer mechanisms and asset protections of the Patterson Family Trust, framing it as a hypothetical discussion about modern wealth management. I sat across the table from him, slowly slicing my meat, listening to him dig into our financial foundation with the cold precision of an auditor. When I finally cut into the conversation, keeping my voice perfectly level, I pointed out that his questions were highly technical and rather inappropriate for a casual family meal. I expected anyone, to back me up and change the subject. Instead, the entire table turned against me in perfect unison. My father chuckled nervously, smoothing his linen napkin and looking down at his plate. Eager to avoid the sudden tension, he poured himself another glass of wine and muttered something about Roman just having a good business mind. Sloane shot me a venomous, triumphant glare from across the floral centerpiece, her posture rigid with defense. My mother swiftly intervened, placing her hand gently over Roman's forearm to comfort him. She looked at me with deep theatrical disappointment and announced to the room that Roman was merely showing a serious protective interest in Sloane's future. They completely reframed his aggressive financial interrogation as profound romantic devotion. They made me the bitter, paranoid villain for locking the front door while they were eagerly handing a complete stranger the keys to the family vault. Owen noticed the unnatural rhythm of it all, too. My husband spent years of his life observing human behavior and raw emotion through a camera lens. He possesses a flawless, quiet radar for inauthenticity. Roman seemed strangely fixated on Owen, but absolutely not as a future brother-in-law. Roman treated Owen like a hired media consultant providing free services. After dinner one evening, while the rest of the family moved to the drawing room for coffee, Roman cornered Owen out on the cold patio. Roman held a crystal tumbler of scotch and insisted on reviewing the old Patterson marketing portfolios that Owen had helped shoot many years ago. Roman spent 45 solid minutes interrogating Owen about lighting setups and focal lengths. He specifically asked Owen which camera angles best projected a dominant wealthy family brand image to outside investors. He wanted to know how to stand to look like a visionary leader on camera. Owen told me about this interaction later that night as we drove back to our quiet house in the dark. He gripped the steering wheel, keeping his eyes on the road, and noted that Roman was not looking at those legacy photos to admire the family history. Roman was studying them like a stage actor, figuring out exactly where to stand to catch the brightest spotlight. Roman wanted to know how to maximize his own visual real estate within our legacy. He was actively plotting his physical takeover of the frame, learning the exact angles to manipulate the Patterson image for his own benefit. Simultaneously, Sloane launched an aggressive, relentless public relations campaign disguised as a whirlwind romance. Her social media feeds transformed overnight into a heavily curated stream of calculated moments with Roman. There were dozens of photos of them clinking crystal champagne glasses at high-end charity auctions, posing in front of leased private jets they did not own, and walking through Patterson development sites wearing hard hats that looked far too clean to be real. She captioned these posts with pretentious phrases like, "The future looks aligned and building the empire together." The comment section was flooded with validation from Briar Glen elites, which only fit her delusion. None of it felt like genuine love to me. It reeked of a desperate performance. It was a calculated attempt to broadcast a power couple narrative to the entire town, establishing his authority and cementing his place in the hierarchy before he had even earned a single ounce of trust. Despite the glaring red flags waving frantically in my face, I kept my mouth shut. I maintained my position on the periphery, watching the charade unfold. I continuously reminded myself that a man being overly confident, impeccably dressed, and intensely ambitious was not a punishable crime in the corporate world I inhabited. My daily job at Blackidge Civic Partners required me to suspect everyone of fraud. So I blamed my own profession for my deep mistrust of Roman. I forced myself to swallow my instincts. I relied on my logic, telling myself I was just being a cynical older sister actively looking for flaws in a man who simply wanted to impress my difficult, demanding family. I chose to stay silent, preserving the fragile peace my father loved so much. I held on to that silence tightly right up until the annual winter garler, the exact night when all my quiet, lingering suspicions violently transformed into a real bleeding wound. That night proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that his floorless charm was merely the anesthetic they used before making the first brutal cut. The winter legacy dinner was held on the second Saturday of December. The venue was the crown jewel of the latest Patterson residential project, a sprawling 10,000-T model home situated on a snowy ridge overlooking the valley. Every inch of the property was meticulously staged to project an image of untouchable, multi-generational prosperity. A string quartet played softly in the grand foyer. Waiters in pristine uniforms carried heavy silver trays holding glasses of champagne that cost $150 a bottle. I walked through the towering double doors, bracing my shoulders, mentally preparing myself for a long, exhausting night of rigid posture and empty corporate pleasantries. My husband walked quietly beside me. Owen wore a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit. He carried a bottle of 20-year-old reserve bourbon wrapped in dark velvet as a gift from my parents. He looked handsome, grounded, and entirely out of place in a room designed specifically to make people feel small and inadequate. The evening unfolded with a sickening predictability, but the social temperature had shifted drastically since the autumn dinners. My mother glided across the heated marble floors, her arm looped tightly through Roman's. She introduced him to the mayor, to the regional bank executives, and to our primary construction partners. Her voice carried over the classical music, ringing with an aggressive, territorial pride. She introduced him by looking the investors right in the eye and saying, "He just fits us." She repeated that exact phrase at least half a dozen times before 800. She delivered those words with a warm, triumphant pitch that she had never, not even once in 11 years of marriage, used when speaking about my husband. Roman absorbed the adoration perfectly. He leaned into the strategic conversations with the city planners, nodding seriously, throwing out industry buzzwords about municipal bonds and zoning leverage as if he had built the entire town with his own bare hands. He belonged seamlessly to the theater of it all. Owen, on the other hand, gravitated naturally toward the edges of the room. It was not out of shyness or intimidation, but out of a deep, ingrained habit of professional observation. Having spent his career composing frames and hunting for the perfect angle, he instinctively stepped back to watch the machinery of a party operate. He stood near a massive floor, tow-sailing window, quietly analyzing the way the amber chandelier light interacted with the dark winter glass. Because he was studying the room rather than performing for it, the guests made their own cruel assumptions. A wealthy developer from a neighboring county approached Owen, handed him an empty cocktail glass, and asked him where the restrooms were located. A few minutes later, the wife of a local politician walked up to him, pointed at the staging area, and asked if he was the hired photographer, demanding to know when the formal portraits would begin. Owen did not flush with anger. He gently directed the developer to the hallway and politely informed the politician's wife that he was just a guest. He absorbed the indignity with a calm, silent grace that only made my chest ache harder. The turning point of the night arrived just before dessert was scheduled to be served. The public relations team had set up a staging area in front of the massive stone fireplace in the great room. The objective was to capture the definitive family and next generation portrait for the upcoming New Year marketing campaign. The hired media crew adjusted their soft boxes and light meters, clearing the floor of stray guests. My mother began herding us toward the hearth. My father took his place in the center, adjusting his silk tie and looking entirely oblivious to the rising tension. Sloane positioned herself on his right, her posture impossibly straight, her chin lifted to catch the warmest light. As the photographer asked the family to gather closely, I moved by pure, undeniable instinct. I turned toward the perimeter of the room and reached my hand out, intending to pull my husband to my side, where he belonged before my fingers could even brush the fabric of his sleeve. My mother stepped seamlessly into my path. She did not shove me. She did not raise her voice. She simply placed a cool, manicured hand on my forearm and offered a devastatingly gentle smile. "Owen, would you mind taking this?" she asked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Roman should be in this one." The words dropped into the space between us, heavy and cold as lead. I waited for the room to react. I waited for my father to clear his throat and state that Owen was family and needed to be in the shot. I waited for Sloane to awkwardly laugh and tell her new boyfriend to step aside. I waited for a gasp, a murmur, a single voice of objection from the dozens of influential guests watching us. Nothing happened. Absolute, suffocating silence blanketed the immediate area. The complete lack of protest was infinitely more violent than a shouted insult. The silence meant everyone in the room agreed. It meant the entire social ecosystem of Briar Glen found it completely natural and entirely logical to erase my husband from our legacy. They all understood the unspoken rule that Roman was the aesthetic upgrade, the necessary addition, and Owen was just the hired help, holding space until someone better came along. Owen stopped moving. He stood completely still for exactly one heartbeat. I watched his jaw tighten just a fraction of an inch. I saw the profound humiliation register in his dark eyes, followed immediately by a hardened, impenetrable resolve. He did not cause a scene. He did not drop the bourbon onto the marble floor and walk out the front door. He preserves his dignity by never letting the people who hurt him see him bleed. Owen stepped forward, approached the hired photographer, and politely asked to borrow the primary camera. He checked the aperture, adjusted the ISO setting to account for the roaring fire behind us, and took 3 precise steps backward. Roman slid eagerly into the empty space on my left. His shoulder brushed heavily against mine. He smelled like imported cologne and predatory confidence. He stood exactly where my husband was supposed to stand, beaming perfectly for the lens, as if he had been born into that very spot. Owen raised the heavy camera to his face, hiding his eyes behind the viewfinder. The mechanical click of the shutter sounded like a bone snapping in the quiet room. He pressed the button again. 1, 2, 3 flashes of blinding white light filled the space, burning the image into the digital sensor and into my brain forever. The true suffocating agony of that moment did not stem from my mother's calculated cruelty. It did not come from Roman's smug, victorious grin. The sharpest, most unforgiving pain came from my own inaction. I am a woman who negotiates hostile takeovers. I dissect predatory contracts for a living. I am supposed to be fearless and untouchable. Yet, trapped under the blinding lights of that fireplace, paralyzed by a lifetime of toxic conditioning and the desperate, pathetic urge to keep the family peace, I did nothing. My feet felt as though they had been nailed to the floor. I let my arm drop uselessly to my side. I looked straight into the lens. I stood perfectly still and allowed my husband to become the cameraman for his own public execution. The drive away from the model home was entirely devoid of sound. The heater in our sedan hummed softly, fighting off the biting December chill, but the air inside the cabin felt completely frozen. I sat rigidly in the passenger seat, my hands folded tightly in my lap, staring blankly at the dark asphalt illuminated by our headlights. I waited for the explosion. I waited for Owen to slam his palm against the leather steering wheel, to curse my mother, to demand an explanation for my pathetic paralysis in front of the fireplace, but the explosion never came. Owen drove with absolute terrifying precision. His breathing was even. His profile was relaxed in the dim glow of the dashboard. He did not speed, nor did he grip the wheel with white knuckles. He drove the speed limit exactly. That profound, unshakable calm shattered me worse than any screaming match ever could. His composure was not an act of suppression. It was the quiet resignation of a man who had finally accepted a terrible truth. About 10 miles outside the city limits, on a desolate stretch of road lined with dormant oak trees, he eased the car onto the gravel shoulder. He shifted the gear into park. He left the engine running, the headlights carving a path into the darkness ahead. He did not turn to face me immediately. He just looked straight ahead into the night. When he finally spoke, his voice was remarkably soft, devoid of any malice or sarcasm. "I am not upset about the photograph," he said, letting the words hang in the quiet car. "I am upset that your family finds me close enough to serve them, but not close enough to stand beside you." The words felt like a physical blow to my chest. He did not accuse me, but his statement held a mirror up to my entire marriage. Staring at his steady hands resting in his lap, I experienced a violent, cascading realization. This was not an isolated incident. My mind raced backward through our 11 years together, cataloging every single paper cut I had previously dismissed as harmless friction. I remembered the holiday dinners where he was asked to carve the turkey in the kitchen while the men drank scotch in the study. I remembered the charity auctions where he was tasked with holding the coats while my father worked with developers. I had spent over a decade rationalizing their behavior, convincing myself it was just their specific brand of thoughtless entitlement. I lied to myself because confronting the reality meant acknowledging my own complicity. I had let them turn the man I loved into their personal attendant. The undeniable clarity of his statement stripped away all my excuses. I could not pretend any more. We drove the rest of the way home in silence. I did not try to touch his arm or offer empty apologies. Words felt entirely useless against the weight of what had just transpired. Later that night, unable to sleep, I sat alone in our dark living room. The clock on the wall read 2 in the morning. I opened my laptop and navigated to the official social media page for the family enterprise. There it was, uploaded just 3 hours prior. The professionally edited, high-resolution image glowed brightly on my screen. The composition was flawless. My father stood tall. My mother looked impeccably regal. Sloane beamed with arrogant triumph, and Romans stood intimately close to me, his shoulder overlapping mine, projecting the exact image of a unified, powerful dynasty. Below the image, the caption read, "The people shaping our next chapter." There was no mention of the photographer. There was no acknowledgement of the man who had actually framed the legacy they were so desperate to project. My husband had been surgically excised from the narrative, as if he had never existed at all. The post already had over 2,000 likes and dozens of comments from local elites praising the beautiful family vision. The following morning, I waited until exactly 9 in the morning to make the phone call. I sat at my home office desk, sipping black coffee, and dialed my mother's private line. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and energized from the success of the previous evening. I did not exchange pleasantries. I asked her directly why she forced Owen out of the family portrait. Lillian sighed heavily into the receiver, the kind of exaggerated theatrical sigh a parent uses when dealing with an unreasonable toddler. Please do not start this morning with unnecessary drama, she said, her tone dripping with patronizing dismissiveness. It is merely a photograph. Tell Owen not to be so sensitive. He knows we appreciate him in his own way, but Roman simply fits the brand image better. We have major investors looking at our portfolio this quarter, and we need to project a certain caliber of unified strength. Roman looks the part. Owen understands how visual marketing works. She spoke about my husband as if he were an outdated piece of lobby furniture that needed to be swapped out before a corporate inspection. I ended the call without saying goodbye. Less than an hour later, my phone vibrated. It was my father. Conrad never called unless Lillian dispatched him to smooth over a rough edge she had created. His voice was low, coated in that false, soothing cadence he used to close difficult land deals. "Listen, kid," he started, entirely bypassing any acknowledgement of the disrespect. "Your mother is just focused on the business transition. Roman has a lot of momentum right now. Let us not stir up an already beautiful week over some bruised egos. We are a family. We need to stay focused on the bigger picture." The bigger picture, that was his ultimate shield. Sitting in my quiet house, listening to my father beg me to abandon my husband's dignity just to maintain his own domestic peace, something fundamental broke inside me. Conrad was not calling to apologize. He was calling to manage me. He was asking me to swallow the humiliation so he would not have to deal with my mother's displeasure. I hung up the phone and placed it face down on the desk. I am a woman who fixes things. My entire life, my primary value to the Patterson family had been my utility. I reviewed their commercial leases for free, saving them tens of thousands of dollars in billable legal hours. I drafted the risk assessment protocols for their new developments. I edited my father's keynote speeches to ensure he sounded like a visionary rather than a salesman. I quietly connected Sloan with municipal zoning board members to fast-track her pet projects. I was the invisible architect of their security. I provided the invisible safety net they constantly took for granted. I stood up from my desk. I walked to my filing cabinet and pulled out the thick leather-bound folder containing the preliminary contracts for the Hollow Creek House redevelopment, a massive project they desperately needed me to review before Monday morning. I walked into the kitchen and dropped the entire folder straight into the trash can. I returned to my desk, opened my email client, and systematically canceled my upcoming introductory meetings with the regional bank executives. Those were men who only took my father's calls because they trusted my personal risk assessments. I permanently deleted the shared drive containing the master draft of my mother's upcoming charity gala speech, a speech I had spent 3 weeks polishing so she would not sound hopelessly out of touch with the local middle class. I formally removed myself as a secondary administrator on their corporate compliance software, immediately stripping away my oversight of their vendor contracts. I severed every single invisible thread of professional and legal protection I had meticulously woven around them over the past decade. If they genuinely believed Roman was the brilliant strategic savior they had been waiting for, they could let him do the tedious reading, the complicated writing, and the heavy legal lifting. They could let the man who looked so perfect in a tailored suit defend them against aggressive municipal auditors. For the first time in my 38 years of life, I was not consumed by fiery, blinding anger. Anger is loud. Anger is messy. Anger makes you reckless and emotional, which is exactly how my family expected me to react. So, they could easily label me as the unstable, jealous older sister. I did not feel hot. I felt entirely, terrifyingly cold. The kind of cold that settles deep into your bones and clears your mind with absolute razor-sharp precision. I realized that throwing a tantrum would accomplish absolutely nothing. Demanding an apology from people incapable of remorse was a complete waste of breath. When a woman like me gets truly cold, she stops arguing. She stops begging for a seat at a table she helped build. She simply walks away from the table, locks the heavy doors from the outside, and starts calculating exactly how to dismantle the entire room. It happened on a Tuesday evening, exactly 3 days after I quietly severed my invisible safety net from the family business. I was sitting at my kitchen island, nursing a glass of sparkling water, when an email notification pinged on my tablet. The sender was Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was a senior semi-retired member of the Patterson Estate Group Board of Directors. 2 years prior, I had pulled Arthur out of a disastrous commercial liability lawsuit by finding a single misaligned indemnity clause in a vendor contract. He was old school, terrible with modern technology, and frequently forwarded emails to the wrong people. My name was likely right next to his personal assistant's name in his digital address book. The subject line read, "Draft Board Packet for Hollow Creek Restructuring." My professional instincts flared immediately. I opened the attached document. It was a massive 90-page PDF detailing the complete financial overhaul of the Hollow Creek House project. I bypassed the glossy introductory slides and scrolled directly to the executive summary and compensation schedules. That is where you always find the bodies buried in corporate documents. Roman Hale was not merely listed as my sister's new romantic partner or a casual consultant. According to the draft, Roman was being officially positioned as a strategic partner for the entire corporate entity. The board was preparing to offer him a 7% advisory equity grant, 7% in the world of high-end real estate development, handing over a 7% equity stake to an external advisor before a single piece of earth was moved was not just generous. It was bordering on financial malpractice. They were handing him the keys to the kingdom, effectively diluting the family ownership to make room for his unearned authority. My eyes scanned further down the page, absorbing the dense financial jargon. The situation was infinitely worse than a simple equity giveaway. To fund Roman's aggressive, highly speculative expansion strategy, Patterson Estate Group needed to secure a massive multi-million-dollar bridge loan from a Tier 1 commercial lender. The proposed collateral for this massive debt caught my breath in my throat. They were planning to pledge the primary acreage held within the Patterson Legacy Trust. That specific land was the untouchable bedrock of our family wealth. My grandfather had structured the trust with paranoid precision. Pledging those assets as collateral required the unanimous legally binding consent of all living adult beneficiaries. That meant my father, my mother, my sister, and me. I scrolled frantically to page 45, specifically looking for the risk mitigation and compliance section. There it was under a bold subheading labeled Family Alignment. A neatly typed paragraph explicitly stated that all trust beneficiaries, including Ree Patterson, had been thoroughly briefed by executive management and were in full unreserved agreement to pledge the legacy assets to secure the loan facility. I stared at my own name on the glowing screen. I had never been briefed. I had never been asked. I had certainly never agreed to risk my inheritance to fund Roman's ego. They had essentially presented my silent compliance as a guaranteed corporate asset to the board and the bank. They assumed I would just fall in line and sign the paperwork when the time came. Just as I had always done to keep the peace, I needed more proof. I immediately logged into the secure online portal for the Patterson Legacy Trust. As a primary beneficiary, I had full read access to the communication logs, something my family likely forgot since I rarely interfered with the wealth managers. I pulled the digital records for the past 2 months. The logs painted a sickening picture of unauthorized access. Over the past 8 weeks, Roman had attended 4 separate closed-door meetings with our private bankers. He was heavily copied on internal emails discussing asset liquidity and bridge loan terms. In these emails, he did not speak like an outsider. He used phrases like our generational wealth, our long-term family vision, and our combined assets. He had been dating Sloan for less than 3 months, that he was confidently sitting in mahogany boardrooms, speaking to our financial guardians as if he were the newly appointed patriarch of the Patterson bloodline. I printed the entire 90-page packet, the email logs, and the collateral proposals. I cleared the dining room table and spread the documents out under the harsh overhead light. Owen walked in from his home studio a few minutes later, wiping a lens cloth on his jeans. He stopped when he saw the sea of paper covering the mahogany wood. I did not say a word. I simply slid the printed copy of Roman's investment pitch deck across the table toward him. It was a separate attachment from the email, a glossy, high-resolution presentation titled Roman Hale Track Record and Vision designed to prove his past successes to the Patterson board. Owen picked up the packet. His eyes, trained by decades of looking for the truth in a frame, immediately caught something wrong. He flipped past the text-heavy pages and focused entirely on the project photographs. Roman claimed to have spearheaded several massive commercial renovations across the Sun Belt. Owen stopped on page 12. It was a full-lead image of a sleek, ultra-modern hotel lobby featuring a massive cascading water feature and custom ambient lighting. Roman claimed this was his crown jewel project in Atlanta. Owen stared at the image for a long time. The muscles in his jaw tightened. He placed the paper down gently, turned around, and walked back to his studio. He returned 2 minutes later, carrying his heavy shockproof external hard drive. He plugged it into my laptop, opened his master archive software, and typed a few keywords into the search bar. He clicked on a folder dated 5 years ago. He opened a raw, uncompressed image file and turned the laptop screen toward me. It was the exact same photograph of the Atlanta hotel lobby. It was not similar. It was identical. Owen had been hired by a prominent architectural firm 5 years ago to shoot their award-winning interior design portfolio. Roman had taken my husband's intellectual property. He had horizontally flipped the image, aggressively cropped the bottom right corner to eliminate Owen's professional watermark, and applied a heavy color grading filter to make the lighting look slightly different. Roman was using my husband's actual talent to build a fake empire. Owen leaned over the table and began scrutinizing the rest of the pitch deck with cold, clinical precision. Once you see the first lie, the rest of the illusion falls apart quickly. He pointed out faint pixel distortions along the edges of construction site photos where other corporate logos had been hastily and unprofessionally erased. He identified at least 3 other images as standard purchasable stock photos that had been heavily manipulated to look like proprietary development sites. Roman Hale was not a brilliant strategic capital advisor. He was a phantom. He was a professional con artist carefully constructing a fortress out of stolen bricks, forged timelines, and plagiarized photography. And he was doing it all while wearing a custom suit and drinking my father's expensive scotch. I sat back in my chair, the cold leather pressing against my spine. The air in the room felt incredibly still. The devastating humiliation Owen had endured at the winter dinner suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. It was not just an impulsive act of snobbery from my mother. It was not just a thoughtless slight. It was a necessary, calculated maneuver in a much larger war. My family was actively clearing the deck. They needed Owen entirely out of the frame because his mere presence as a professional visual artist was a direct threat to Roman's fabricated visual history. They needed me marginalized and compliant so I would not look too closely at the financial documents, draining our trust. They were perfectly willing to push my husband out the door and leverage my future, all to make room for a charming parasite who validated their obsessive need for a flawless, wealthy aesthetic. They were handing over the entire Patterson legacy to a thief simply because the thief knew exactly how to smile for the camera. The most instinctual response to discovering a massive orchestrated fraud is to scream. Human nature demands an immediate fiery confrontation. Most people would have stormed into the Patterson Estate Group headquarters, slammed the plagiarized pitch deck onto the mahogany boardroom table, and demanded an audience. They would have yelled. They would have pointed fingers. I did none of those things. I knew exactly who I was dealing with. If I confronted my mother and my sister with the raw evidence of their profound gullibility, they would not apologize. Narcissism does not operate on logic. It operates on self-preservation. Lillian and Sloane would have instantly closed ranks around Roman, fiercely defending him simply to protect their own fragile egos. They would have accused me of fabricating the evidence out of spite, so I chose silence. I let them continue to believe they were the smartest people in the room. I let them think my sudden distance was merely a sulking retreat. While they celebrated their new corporate savior, I quietly went to work building a guillotine. On Wednesday morning, I hired Naomi Voss. Naomi was a ruthlessly efficient trust attorney based in Nashville, entirely outside of my father's local sphere of influence. She possessed a terrifying reputation for dismantling complex familial wealth structures. I did not hire her to negotiate. I hired her to excavate. I instructed Naomi to quietly pull every single legal filing, side, and preliminary agreement connected to the Patterson Legacy Trust over the past 6 months. Simultaneously, I retained Mara Ellison, a forensic accountant who specialized in corporate fraud and phantom entities. I handed Mara the printed pitch deck and gave her one clear directive. I told her to trace every single dollar Roman Hale claimed to have generated, to cross-reference every limited liability company he had ever registered, and to map out the exact legal structure he was attempting to build within my family's company. I gave them both unlimited billable hours to map the entire minefield before I took a single step. Then I executed my first overt maneuver. It was not a phone call. It was a formal, heavily formalized piece of paper. I had a courier deliver a certified legal letter directly to the executive suite of Patterson Estate Group addressed to the board of directors and copied to their primary lenders. The letter was a masterpiece of cold corporate detachment. It stated clearly that effective immediately Patterson Estate Group was strictly prohibited from using my name, my professional title, or my corporate affiliations in any internal or external documents, loan applications, or pitch materials without my express, written, and notarized consent. The impact of that single letter was immediate and devastating. For over a decade, my family had used my sterling professional reputation as a silent guarantor. When banks saw my name listed under family alignment, they assumed the deal was thoroughly vetted and completely safe. By legally withdrawing my name, I pulled the foundational pillar out from under their new risky bridge loan. Panic began to ripple through their executive offices. Without my implicit endorsement, their compliance department suddenly had to do their own due diligence, a task they were entirely unequipped to handle because I had always done it for them. While the corporate side of my family began to stagger, Owen executed a flawless, quiet strike of his own for the past 7 years. Owen had photographed my mother's massive spring charity garler entirely free of charge. It was an expectation she never even bothered to voice anymore. She simply assumed his labor belonged to her. On Thursday afternoon, Owen sent a beautifully polite, highly professional email to my mother's event coordinator. He did not mention the winter dinner. He did not express a single ounce of anger. He simply stated that due to his expanding studio schedule, he would not be able to offer complimentary coverage for the upcoming spring garler. Attached to the email was a standard itemized invoice detailing his corporate date rate, his editing fees, and his equipment rental costs totaling exactly $8,500. He noted that if they wish to retain his services, a 50% non-refundable deposit was required within 5 business days. Lillian viewed this standard business practice as an act of profound personal treason. In her mind, the peasantry had just handed the Queen a bill. She refused to call Owen directly, too outraged to speak to him, but the silence from her end was deafening. Sloane, however, could not contain her venom. My phone began lighting up with a barrage of text messages late Friday night. She accused me of orchestrating Owen's invoice just to ruin my mother's mood. She called me petty, but it was her 4th message that accidentally handed me the exact emotional closure I needed. You are just doing all of this because you are insanely jealous. Sloane wrote, you are furious because for the first time in my life, I have a man who actually matches the vision of this family. Roman belongs at the center of the table. You should have known Owen never fit the picture. I read the text twice. She had just confessed, in plain written text, Pushing Owen out of the photograph had not been a spontaneous mistake or a clumsy oversight. It was a calculated, premeditated act of exclusion. They had discussed it. They had planned it. Sloane was entirely aware of what they were doing, and she was proud of it. I did not reply to her message. I took a screenshot, saved it to a secure folder, and deleted the conversation thread from my screen. The real test of my restraint came on Saturday morning when my father called. Conrad had clearly been dispatched to manage the escalating crisis. The banks were asking uncomfortable questions about my legal letter. My mother was having heart palpitations over Owen's invoice, and the peaceful kingdom Conrad so desperately relied upon was actively crumbling. He bypassed any normal greeting. "Listen to me, Ree," he said, his voice dropping into that familiar condescending tone of false authority. "You need to call off these lawyers immediately. You are making a massive mistake. Roman is putting together a deal that is going to take this entire company to the next level. We are talking about generational wealth expansion. You cannot sabotage this family's future simply because you have a bruised ego over a stupid photograph." He was still trying to shrink the issue. He was trying to reduce a massive coordinated corporate fraud and a profound betrayal of my marriage into a silly, hysterical female reaction to a family picture. He wanted me to feel small so he could feel safe. I sat at my dining table, looking out the window at the quiet street. I felt no urge to explain the stuff of photographs to him. I felt no desire to warn him about the 7% equity trap. He had already made his choice. He had chosen the slick, agreeable liar over the daughter who had spent her entire adult life keeping him out of bankruptcy court. I took a slow, deep breath. My voice was perfectly steady, devoid of any warmth or familial affection. "If Roman is truly the visionary genius you all believe he is," I replied calmly, "then he will have absolutely no problem securing that bridge loan without my name on the paperwork. If he is destined to take the company to the next level, he certainly does not need a bitter, jealous sister dragging him down. You all made it very clear who you want standing next to you. So I am stepping out of the frame entirely. Let him save you." I did not wait for his response. I disconnected the call. For the first time in my life, I stopped catching them. I simply pulled my hands away and watched gravity take over. The silence that followed was not the peaceful quiet my father loved. It was the terrifying, breathless silence of a system that had just stepped out into thin air and finally realized there was absolutely nothing beneath its feet. The DOS arrived continuously over the next 72 hours, transforming my dining room table into a war room of financial and legal devastation. The information did not trickle in. It flooded my space in heavy, undeniable waves of documented truth. Laura Ellison delivered her forensic accounting report first, a thick binder that completely dismantled the polished, wealthy facade of the man eating dinner at my parents' table. Roman Hale was not a high net worth strategic advisor. He was a financial ghost. 4 years prior, he had operated a limited liability company out of a cheap leased office in Arizona. He had managed to secure $3 million in seed capital for a boutique hotel renovation by aggressively misrepresenting his operational capabilities and falsifying his subcontractor agreements when the project inevitably imploded, leaving an empty concrete shell and unpaid crews. The primary investors sued him for gross negligence and fraud. The lawsuit was ultimately settled out of court behind a strict non-disclosure agreement, which kept his name out of the major financial papers, but the internal damage was catastrophic. His personal credit was entirely decimated. He possessed zero liquid assets. He was heavily leveraged, running from quiet debts and desperately hunting for a wealthy host to absorb his failures. My family was not his new business venture. They were his latest mark. Less than 24 hours later, Naomi Voss sent her legal findings via a secure encrypted file. Her discoveries regarding the Patterson Legacy Trust escalated the situation from a corporate scam to a massive immediate legal liability. Roman had not simply been sitting quietly in the corner during those private banking meetings. According to the internal loan officer memos Naomi had legally subpoenaed, Roman had actively directed the negotiations for the new bridge loan. When the senior underwriters pushed back on the collateral requirements, specifically asking for the legally mandated signatures of all living trust beneficiaries, Roman deployed a calculated verbal forgery. He explicitly assured the bank executives that the eldest daughter, meaning me, had already provided enthusiastic agreement in principle. He claimed my formal signature was merely a logistical formality that would be delivered before the close of the quarter. He was actively using my spotless professional reputation as a counterfeit currency to borrow tens of millions of dollars. While the lawyers traced the money, my husband systematically dissected the visual lines. Owen spent his evenings in his studio working under the glow of 3 massive high-resolution monitors. He stripped the metadata from every single image in the pitch deck Roman had presented to the board. The final autopsy of that portfolio was clinical and absolute. Owen proved that 3 of the massive commercial property renovations Roman claimed as his own crowning achievements actually belonged to a highly respected mid-sized architectural firm based out of Chicago. Roman had simply stolen the images from their public website. 2 other breathtaking building facades in the presentation were proven to be cheap royalty-free stock images heavily masked with digital color grading filters to obscure their true origins. And the most sickening piece of evidence remained the Atlanta hotel lobby photographs stolen directly from my husband's own commercial archives. Roman was entirely hollow. Every single brick of his supposed empire was scavenged from the hard work of actual professionals. But the most agonizing twist of the entire investigation did not come from the bank memos or the plagiarized photographs. It came from a series of recovered digital communication logs. I had spent the last several weeks operating under the assumption that my sister was simply a naive, desperate woman blinded by a charismatic con artist. I pied her gullibility. I was completely wrong. Through a deep sweep of the corporate email servers, we discovered a hidden folder of correspondence between Sloan and Roman dating back to the very first week of their relationship. Sloan was not a victim. She was the architect who had intentionally left the back door wide open. It was my sister who had meticulously compiled a massive digital folder containing our family's most sensitive internal documents. She had set Roman the exact maturity dates of our trust assets, the specific liquidity thresholds required for our bridge loans, and the private land appraisals for the Hollow Creek properties. More devastatingly, she had provided him with a detailed psychological blueprint on exactly how to manipulate me. In one lengthy message sent late at night, Sloan explicitly advised Roman to push the financial restructuring during the highly publicized spring social season. She wrote that I possessed a pathological need to maintain public dignity. She assured him that if they cornered me in front of the right crowd of investors and society elites, I would never dare to cause a scene. She always softens if she is pressured at the exact right time. Her message read, "She cares too much about keeping Dad comfortable to ever blow up a deal in public." Reading those words felt like swallowing broken glass. I realized in that moment that Sloan did not just want a wealthy boyfriend. She was actively weaponizing this fraudster to flip the entire power dynamic of the Patterson family. She hated my quiet authority so much that she was perfectly willing to burn our generational wealth to the ground just so she could rule over the ashes. The betrayal was absolute, severing the final decaying thread of sisterhood I had been blindly holding onto for 30 years, completely oblivious to the massive trap slowly closing around them. My mother and sister accelerated their grand illusion. Lillian was in the final, frantic stages of organizing the Spring Legacy Weekend. It was slated to be the most extravagant corporate and social event in the history of our small town. The guest list included over 200 local politicians, regional bank presidents, and primary investors. The entire weekend was meticulously designed around one singular dramatic announcement. Lillian planned to take the stage after the gala dinner and publicly declare Roman Hale as the new strategic partner of Patterson Estate Group. To cement this new reality, she had hired a renowned, obnoxiously expensive editorial photographer from New York. Her explicit goal was to shoot an entirely new series of family portraits during the event, intending to systematically replace every single legacy publication, brochure, and website banner with fresh images featuring Romans standing firmly at the center of our family. They sent an invitation to my house. It was printed on heavy cream-colored cardstock with gold embossed lettering. They firmly believed that if they could just get me to walk through the heavy oak doors of that country club, my lifelong conditioning would take over. They banked their entire corporate future on my predictable silence. They assumed the overwhelming presence of high society guests, the heavy suffocating atmosphere of prestige, and the sheer momentum of the public announcement would force me to swallow my objections, smile for the cameras, and sign away my leverage. They expected me to fall in line, exactly as Sloane had promised him I would. I sat at my dining table late into the night, the house completely silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I stared at the mountains of irrefutable evidence spread out before me, the Arizona fraud settlement, the bank memos detailing his lies, the plagiarized portfolio, and my sister's treacherous emails. I stacked the papers into neat, perfectly aligned piles, my hands completely steady. I looked up at Owen. He was standing quietly by the window, watching the street lights cut through the dark, waiting for me to process the final pieces of the puzzle. I did not feel a single ounce of hesitation. The cold, analytical part of my brain had completely taken over. I looked him dead in the eyes and made a promise that would permanently alter the trajectory of everyone involved. "This time I am not just protecting you," I said, my voice steady, sharp, and entirely void of mercy. "I am going to force them to look straight at what they chose." 5 days before the spring legacy weekend was scheduled to begin, my mother initiated her final desperate act of emotional management. She telephoned me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing a municipal zoning contract. Her voice was uncharacteristically soft, completely stripped of its usual aristocratic command. She invited Owen and me to a private intimate dinner at the main family estate. She framed the evening as an opportunity for a fresh start. She promised, with a heavy practice sigh, that things would be different this time. She spoke the words with the florless sincerity of a seasoned politician trying to close a difficult high-stakes negotiation before a deadline. I accepted her invitation without a single condition. I did not demand an apology for the humiliation Owen suffered at the winter gala. I did not ask for a guarantee regarding his future treatment. I simply said yes, deliberately adopting a tone of exhausted, defeated surrender. My immediate compliance sent a wave of profound, palpable relief crashing through the entire Patterson household. My father believed his precious, undisturbed peace had finally been restored. My mother believed her supreme authority remained completely unchallenged. They genuinely believed the storm had passed. Through the continued legal sweep of the corporate network conducted by my forensic accountant, I saw exactly how deep their arrogance ran. My sister sent a brief, triumphant message to her boyfriend that very afternoon. She told Roman that I always fold when the pressure gets high enough. They mistook my strategic, calculating silence for absolute weakness. They thought I was returning to my designated role as the obedient, useful workhorse. During that private reconciliation dinner, I played my part with absolute perfection. I was the accommodating, pleasant daughter they demanded. I complimented the roasted duck. I politely asked Roman about his fictional golf handicap, listening intently as he spun elaborate lies about playing exclusive courses in California. I allowed my father to dominate the conversation with his hollow philosophies on generational wealth and corporate legacy. I offered absolutely no resistance. I did not correct their assumptions. I did not challenge Roman's fabricated business credentials. This is the most dangerous kind of silence a person can wield. It is the silence that convinces your opponent they have won the entire war before the final battle has even commenced. I sat across from them, slowly sipping my red wine, watching them toast to their brilliant, lucrative future. I thoroughly enjoyed the warm, comfortable illusion I had explicitly built for them. I let them feel safe, knowing that the higher they climbed into their delusion, the more devastating the impact would be when I finally removed the foundation. While my family was busy selecting the perfect floral arrangements and finalizing the catering menus for the grand announcement, my legal team executed a devastating invisible strike against their financial architecture. On Thursday morning, Naomi Voss formally served a highly classified legal notice directly to the primary trustee of the Patterson Legacy Trust. The document was an absolute masterpiece of legal barricading. It mandated an immediate indefinite freeze on any and all decisions involving the use of legacy assets as financial collateral. The injunction did not merely suggest a pause. It demanded a full halt, explicitly citing credible documented evidence of gross misrepresentation and predatory corporate structuring. By freezing the trust, Naomi effectively cut the main artery of Roman's massive bridge loan without the legacy land to act as a guarantee. The Tier 1 banks would immediately freeze all capital distribution. The entire development project was now secretly bleeding to death, and the executives at Patterson Estate Group were entirely unaware that their financial heart had just stopped beating. I did not stop at paralyzing the trust. A public execution requires credible, impartial witnesses who cannot be manipulated by my mother's social tears or my father's false diplomacy. Acting entirely within my authority as the senior contracts director, I formally invited two highly respected independent members of the Patterson Estate Group Board of Directors to attend the weekend gala. These were strict, uncompromising men whose sole professional loyalty was to the fiduciary health of the company. I framed their invitations under the extremely dry bureaucratic guise of witnessing a governance transition. It was a mundane administrative phrase that I knew my mother would completely ignore. Lillian was entirely consumed by the editorial lighting setup and the seating charts. She barely glanced at the finalized guest list, completely failing to realize I had just positioned two impartial judges in the front row of her carefully orchestrated theater. She thought she was inviting an audience to applaud her genius. She did not know I had invited a jury to convict her. Owen, meanwhile, agreed to bring his professional camera equipment to the main event. My mother interpreted his agreement as a pathetic, desperate attempt to win back her favor. She assumed he was finally willing to provide his free labor just to remain in the periphery of her wealthy orbit. She believed she had successfully trained him to accept his lowered status. She was spectacularly wrong. Owen was not packing light meters and soft boxes to capture her triumph. He spent Friday evening carefully loading his heavy reinforced gear bags with a very different kind of arsenal. Inside his sleek black cases resting right next to his high-resolution camera bodies was the complete, undeniable copyright dossier. He packed perfectly printed high-gloss comparisons of Roman's plagiarized pitch deck alongside the original time-stamped raw files. He included the legally binding commercial licenses, proving his absolute ownership of the images Roman had stolen. He was bringing the raw digital proof required to publicly strip the thief of his stolen armor right in the middle of the ballroom. The final piece of the puzzle arrived late Friday night, less than 24 hours before the grand event was set to begin. I was sitting alone in my dark living room, finalizing the sequence of events in my mind when my personal cell phone illuminated with an incoming message from an unknown number. It was not a text from my family or an update from my lawyers. It was an anonymous submission containing a single, high-resolution screenshot. The image was a captured text conversation between Roman Hale and an old associate from his failed Arizona venture. The associate was asking Roman about the progress of his new wealthy Southern target. Roman's reply was chilling in its arrogant simplicity. He boasted that once the final banking agreements were signed and the trust assets were legally leveraged, he planned to completely cash out before the sisters even realized who truly ran the table. Any normal woman might have felt a surge of blinding rage upon reading those words. She might have felt a profound sense of heartbreak for her manipulated sister and her foolish parents. I felt absolutely none of those things. Staring at the glowing screen of my phone in the quiet dark, I experienced a wave of terrifying, absolute tranquility. I did not feel jealous. I did not feel shattered. I felt an incredible sense of deep settling comfort. Roman Hale had not just revealed his ultimate endgame. He had personally written his own execution order. He had handed me the final, irrefutable proof I needed to burn his fabricated empire to the ground and force my sister to look at the monster she had invited inside our walls. The track was completely set. The actors were blindly moving to their designated marks, and the storm was poised to arrive on exactly the right second. All I had to do now was walk into that ballroom and turn on the lights. The evening at Hollow Creek House was suffocatingly florless. It was a masterclass in manufactured prestige. So beautiful it bordered on the grotesque. Thousands of beeswax candles flickered inside tall glass cylinders, casting a warm, deceptive glow across the newly finished hardwood floors. Waiters glided silently through the crowd, balancing silver trays laden with flutes of imported champagne and delicate culinary creations. The guest list was a concentrated distillation of regional power. Local journalists mingled freely with municipal planners. Tier 1 financial partners stood in tight hush circles with community leaders, and the two independent board members I had personally invited were quietly sipping sparkling water near the grand staircase. Owen and I arrived exactly 45 minutes after the doors opened. We stepped into the grand foyer in perfect, unshakable silence. My husband wore a midnight blue suit that fit him immaculately, holding his heavy camera equipment bag over one shoulder with effortless grace. I wore a tailored black dress that felt more like armor than silk. The very first thing my eyes locked onto was the visual propaganda. Lined up along the primary corridor leading into the main dining hall were 6 massive backlit display boards. They showcased the new corporate campaign. The old legacy portraits, the ones where Owen used to stand quietly at the edge, were entirely gone. In their place was the newly orchestrated layout. Roman was positioned aggressively near the center of the frame, standing just a fraction of an inch ahead of my father. He looked like the undisputed heir apparent, a shadow successor finally claiming his throne. Before I could fully process the audacity of the printed displays, Sloane intercepted us. She wore a shimmering emerald gown and a smile so wide it looked painful. As she reached out to touch my arm in a theatrical display of sisterly affection, the ambient room light caught the massive radiant cut diamond resting prominently on her left ring finger. In a fraction of a second, the true architecture of the evening revealed itself to me. This was never just a corporate announcement. Roman was planning to officially propose to Sloane tonight, likely right after his strategic presentation. He was going to use the overwhelming emotion of a public engagement as an impenetrable shield for his corporate takeover. Who would dare scrutinize a complex financial restructuring agreement immediately after a tearful champagne-soaked marriage proposal? It was a brilliant predatory maneuver designed to trap the board and the bankers in a web of polite mandatory applause. We moved into the main dining hall. The seating arrangements were highly strategic. I was placed at the head table directly to my father's right, with an empty leather chair beside me holding a pristine leather-bound pen. They had literally set the stage for my signature. My mother sat across from me, her posture perfectly rigid, radiating a smug, victorious energy. She looked at me, not with maternal warmth, but with the satisfied relief of a warden watching a rebellious prisoner finally returned to her designated cell. She genuinely believed I had arrived to formally surrender. The dinner service concluded, and the room grew quiet as my father approached the crystal podium. Conrad adjusted his silk tie, gripping the edges of the stand, and delivered his signature hollow speech. He spoke extensively about the next chapter of our legacy using anti-buzzwords, about innovation and aggressive market expansion. He painted a picture of a family united by a singular glorious vision. Then he introduced the supposed architect of that vision. Roman walked to the front of the room to deafening applause. He commanded the space instantly. The massive projection screen behind him illuminated, displaying the exact same pitch deck we had meticulously dissected in my dining room. He stood there, oozing the specific brand of arrogant certainty that only belongs to a man who believes he is the absolute smartest person in a room full of marks. He began his presentation. He clicked through the slides, confidently pointing to the stuffer photographs of the Chicago commercial renovations and the falsely credited Atlanta hotel lobby. He spoke about his past triumphs, inflating his profit margins by 40% and claiming aggressive, entirely fabricated completion timelines. He threw out massive financial projections for the Hollow Creek redevelopment. Numbers so detached from reality they were essentially financial science fiction. The bankers in the front row nodded thoughtfully, completely hypnotized by the sheer confidence of his delivery. Then Roman made his fatal error. He advanced to the slide detailing the bridge loan structure. He placed his hands flat on the podium, leaned into the microphone, and looked directly at the Tier 1 lenders. "We are ready to break ground tomorrow," Roman declared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. And we can do so because we operate with absolute unconditional family alignment. We have the full family support backed by the entire weight of the Patterson legacy. That was my exact cue. I did not shout. I did not slam my hand onto the linen tablecloth. I did not shake. I simply stood up. The movement was smooth, deliberate, and completely unexpected. The rustle of my dress seemed deafening in the sudden, confused quiet of the room. Roman paused, his flawless smile faltering for a microsecond. My father frowned, half rising from his seat, ready to deploy his diplomatic soothing tactics to neutralize whatever disruption he thought I was causing. "Excuse me, Roman," I said. My voice was entirely devoid of anger. It was the calm, measured tone of a surgeon asking for a scalpel. "I need you to pause the screen. We have a slight administrative correction to address before you continue." Before my father could intervene, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the dining hall swung open. Naomi Voss stepped into the room. She was flanked by two process servers carrying thick bound leather portfolios. She did not look at the floral centerpieces or the crystal chandeliers. She walked directly toward the front tables with the terrifying purpose of a legal executioner. I turned to face the room, making deliberate eye contact with the primary loan officers and the independent board members. As the senior contracts director, I must officially clarify the structural integrity of this proposed agreement, I announced, my voice carrying cleanly to the back of the hall. There is no family alignment. Furthermore, there is absolutely no legacy collateral available to secure this venture. I nodded to Naomi. She began distributing the portfolios. She handed the first copy directly to the lead banker from the regional trust. She handed the second and third copies to the independent board members. She placed the fourth copy directly onto the table in front of my father. The room descended into a state of suspended animation. The air grew incredibly thick, suffocating the joyous momentum of the evening. "You are currently holding formal, legally binding notifications," I continued, keeping my posture impeccably straight. "Those documents contain verified evidence of severe financial misrepresentation. They outline the unauthorized, fraudulent use of my name and professional title to secure preliminary banking interest. They detail a pattern of false portfolio claims presented to this very board. Most importantly, they contain the official injunction immediately freezing all assets within the Patterson Legacy Trust. The collateral you are banking on is entirely inaccessible." The silence shattered. The lead banker abruptly dropped his champagne flute onto the table, the glass ringing sharply against the china. The independent board members immediately opened their packets, their faces draining of color as they scanned the forensic accounting summaries. The local journalists instinctively reached for their recording devices, sensing the sudden, catastrophic shift in the atmosphere. My mother sat entirely frozen, her mouth slightly parted, unable to comprehend that the script she had written was being burned to ashes in front of her most important audience. My father looked as though the floor had simply vanished beneath his feet. Roman gripped the sides of the podium, his knuckles turning stark white, the polished veneer cracking violently to reveal the panicked, cornered animal underneath. Conrad finally found his voice, a weak, trembling whisper that barely carried over the rising murmurs of the crowd. "Ree, what are you doing? We can fix this quietly." I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, satisfying finality. They still did not understand the magnitude of their mistake. They thought this was the entirety of my retaliation. They thought I was merely blocking a business deal to prove a point about a contract. I turned my gaze away from my father and locked eyes with my sister, whose hand was still resting on the table, the mute diamond catching the candle light. "I am not doing this quietly, Conrad," I replied, my voice echoing clearly through the microphone Roman had left on the podium. "And you cannot fix it because the financial fraud is only the opening act. The real blow is coming right now." I signaled Owen with a slight, almost imperceptible nod, moving with the calm, methodical precision of a professional who has spent his entire life working under extreme pressure. My husband bypassed the frozen executives and approached the master control desk. He unplugged the presentation laptop Roman had been using and connected his own reinforced external drive directly into the primary projection system. The massive screen spanning the back wall of the dining hall flickered black for a fraction of a second before illuminating the room with the blazing undeniable truth. Gone were the glossy fabricated slides of Roman's imaginary empire. Instead, a harsh high-contrast split screen appeared. On the left side was the Atlanta hotel lobby Roman had boldly claimed as his crowning architectural achievement. On the right side was the original uncompressed, raw digital file complete with the embedded metadata, the exact chronological timestamp from 5 years, and my husband's undeniable copyright explicitly burned into the bottom corner. Owen clicked to the next slide, displaying the legally binding commercial licensing contracts and direct email confirmations from the actual architectural firms in Chicago, explicitly stating that Roman Hale had absolutely no affiliation with their past or present developments. Roman opened his mouth, desperately trying to formulate a defense, but the sheer suffocating volume of indisputable digital proof choked the lies right out of his throat. He had no room to pivot. Before the crowd could even process the stuffy photography, Mara Ellison stepped briskly to the microphone. The forensic accountant did not raise her voice. She delivered her findings with the cold surgical precision of a coroner reading an autopsy report. She publicly outlined the buried Arizona lawsuit that Roman had desperately tried to keep hidden. She exposed how he had aggressively inflated his operational capabilities and relied on wildly fabricated financial projections to bait the regional lenders into a highly toxic, severely compromised venture. She looked directly at the Tier 1 banker sitting in the front row and explicitly stated that funding this project would constitute an act of gross financial negligence. Naomi Voss immediately took the floor next, her legal authority echoing through the completely silent room. She formally announced to the board of directors and the financial partners that any attempt to utilize the Patterson Legacy Trust as corporate collateral was permanently and indefinitely blocked by a court-mandated freeze. The foundational capital for Roman's grand illusion evaporated into thin air right before his eyes. The massive empire he thought he had conquered was pronounced dead before the waitstaff could even clear the appetizer plates. But the final, most devastating strike belonged entirely to me. I pressed a button on the presentation remote, and the screen shifted one last time to display the recovered internal communication logs. There, projected 20s high for the entire room to read, were the private, heavily encrypted emails between my sister and her supposed fiancé. The guests read the exact messages where Sloan voluntarily surrendered our most sensitive financial milestones. They saw the digital blueprints where she explicitly plotted to use my manufactured compliance to push the fraudulent deal past the underwriters. I had brought the receipts. It was no longer a matter of hurt feelings, sibling rivalry, or paranoia. Her profound betrayal of our family was now a verified corporate document exposed under the glaring ballroom lights. The reaction from the room was instantaneous, brutal, and absolute. The lead representative from the regional bank stood up abruptly, buttoned his tailored jacket, and formally withdrew their multi-million-dollar letter of interest right on the spot. The 2 independent board members I had invited convened in the corner for exactly 30 seconds before loudly demanding an emergency governance vote. They immediately stripped my father of his executive signing authority on a temporary basis, citing his catastrophic failure in allowing fraudulent materials to be distributed under the official company banner. Comrade slumped deeply into his leather chair, a broken, exhausted man who had finally run out of rug to sweep his massive problems under. The slick, charming facade melted off Roman completely, revealing the cornered, vicious opportunist underneath, his handsome face contorted with an ugly, raw rage. He did not reach out to comfort the woman he was supposed to propose to. Instead, he whirled around and snarled directly at Sloan, viciously blaming her in front of everyone for failing to control her own sister. In that one cruel, snapping sentence, the devastating reality crashed down on Sloan. She looked at the giant diamond resting heavily on her finger and finally understood that she had never been a cherished partner. She was simply the master key he needed to unlock the Patterson land vault. And now that the lock was broken, she was entirely useless to him. Total chaos engulfed the dining hall. Journalists were furiously typing on their mobile phones, and furious board members were shouting over one another amidst the absolute wreckage of her perfectly curated high society event. My mother panicked. Her brain defaulted to the only defense mechanism she had ever known, controlling the optical narrative. Lillian turned around frantically, her eyes darting past the angry bankers and the fleeing investors, and landed squarely on my husband. Out of pure blind, toxic habit, she pointed a shaking finger at him and desperately ordered Owen to pick up his camera and take a picture of her and my father, begging him to help her save face with the press. The room seemingly froze as I stepped directly between my mother and my husband. I looked straight into her panicked, terrified eyes. My voice was quiet, but it carried the unyielding weight of a 10-ton steel beam. "He does not work for this family," I said slowly, making sure every single person remaining in the room heard the absolute finality in my tone. "He is my family." I took the heavy camera equipment from Owen's hands and casually handed it to one of the terrified freelance media assistants hovering near the wall. I reached out, took my husband's hand, and walked him directly into the dead center of the staging area, but I did not smile. I held my hand up, signaling the assistant to stop. I announced to the remaining crowd that absolutely no family portraits would be taken tonight or any other night until the truth was publicly and entirely acknowledged. Lillian was completely trapped. She had no audience left to manipulate, no glossy corporate facade to hide behind, and no capable daughter left to fix her catastrophic mistakes. Surrounded by the furious investors, the disgusted board members, and the elite society she had spent her entire life trying to impress, my mother had to face the consequences of her cruelty. With her voice trembling, her posture defeated, and her head bowed, Lillian Patterson publicly apologized to Owen Mercer. Her words could not erase a decade of marginalization, but in that agonizing moment, her towering ego was violently dragged down to match the exact level of dignity she had tried to steal from him. I did not burn the Patterson estate group to the ground simply for the fleeting thrill of revenge. I am a builder, not an arsonist. Over the next several months, I spearheaded a ruthless, comprehensive restructuring of the entire corporate governance. Roman was legally excised from every single municipal dealing and vanished from Briar Glen entirely, leaving behind nothing but his debts. I left Sloane to navigate the humiliating wreckage of her own choices, explicitly refusing to shield her from the severe social fallout she had actively engineered. When the new authorized corporate campaign was finally launched the following spring, the layout was fundamentally different. Standing right beside me, firmly anchored in the exact center of the frame, was Owen Mercer. He was not holding a camera. He was not pushed to the periphery, and he would never ever be asked to step aside again. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments so we can connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the like button so this story can be heard by even more people. Thanks to all.